If those who are able to put their cameras on, that would make for a even more interactive presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off here. My name is Christy Simon. I'm the president and CEO of the Central Maryland Chamber. Thanks for joining us this morning for this very special economic forecast with the president and CEO of the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank, Tom Barkin. We're looking forward to a great program. This is one of a series of educational events that have been recorded, and they are accessible for free right on our website. So if you missed any of these sessions, head on over to www.centralmarylandchamber.org to check them out. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media for more information on all of the resources we offer. Please feel free to take a moment to add your contact information into the chat. Then following the event, we will share that with the attendees. And also, if you have any questions throughout the program, feel free to add those in the chat box and we'll get to them a little later in the program. We will be having Q&A moderated by the chair of our Chamber's Regional Economic Development Committee and the winner of our 2020 Small Business of the Year Award, Jonathan Williams from Real Projectives. And now it is my honor to introduce our speaker for today's event. Tom Barkin is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, where he's responsible for monetary policy, bank supervision, payment services, and the Fed's national IT organization. He has held this position since 2018. Tom serves as a voting member in 2021 on the Fed's Chief Monetary Policy Board, the Federal Open Market Committee. He is on the ground continually in the Fed's 5th District, which covers South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, DC, West Virginia, and Maryland. His engagement in the region has brought real attention to areas facing economic challenges. Prior to joining the Richmond Fed, Tom was a senior partner and CFO at McKinsey & Company, a worldwide management consulting firm, where he also oversaw McKinsey's offices in the Southern United States. He served on the board of directors of the Atlanta Fed from 2009 to 2014, and he was the board's chairman from 2013 to 2014. Tom earned his bachelor's, MBA, and law degrees from Harvard University. And it's my honor to turn the program over to you, Tom.
Thanks so much, Christy. It's great to be with everybody. Particular thanks to the 4 of you who've turned your cameras on so I can see you, and feel free to raise a hand if I get anything wrong while I'm watching it. I thought what I might do is just talk a little bit about the journey of the last year, and then turn a little bit to the prospects for the economy going forward. I'm going to give you my views. These aren't the views of anyone else in the Federal Reserve system. And I say that in part so I can be direct, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end. And so if you do have questions, Jonathan will facilitate a Q&A at the end. So let's start by looking backwards. It's been quite a year. If I'd been with you a year ago, we would have been in the middle of an unprecedented economic shutdown. Just to remind you, equity markets dropped 30% last March. Bond markets were in such trouble that even investment grade credits were struggling to roll over their commercial paper. Over 20 million people lost their jobs last April. If we'd been here together a year ago, we would have said our economy was on the edge of the cliff, and we didn't know what was on the other side. Now, fiscal and monetary policy responded with overwhelming force. The Fed stepped up early and powerfully. We took our rates to zero in mid-March and worked to repair financial markets through our balance sheet. We purchased 1.7 trillion of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities in March and April alone last year. We also relaunched a number of Great Recession-era emergency lending facilities that backstop specific bond markets. Congress acted decisively as well. There have been multiple fiscal packages that have supported those who've lost their jobs, small businesses, and industries at risk. To put the magnitude of this fiscal response in perspective, the 5.6 trillion in federal relief spending during this crisis is roughly 6 times the size of the 2009 American Recovery Act. And with this support, the economy has come most of the way back. GDP was up 6.4% in the first quarter, and it's now less than 1% below where it was at its 2019 peak. It's likely going to return to the trend rate by the end of the year. Our recovery has outpaced most of the rest of the world. And the impact of policy on the economy is quite clear and visible. Aggregate disposable income, which normally goes down as people lose their jobs, has gone up It was up 21% in March. Households have increased their savings by well over $2 trillion. And we had a report yesterday that showed how much they've paid down their credit cards. Bank portfolios have remained healthy, given all this support to individuals and businesses. The housing market has been exceptionally strong, in part due to low interest rates, as well as increased interest in home purchases. Increased savings and social distancing fueled a shift in spending from services to goods, and that spending in goods has helped manufacturers. And the worst off have benefited as well from the stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment benefits, and loan forbearance. Now, that said, spending's come back faster than employment. We've got 8.2 million fewer Americans employed than February 2020, and that's down about 5.4% from where they started. And our federal deficit has increased to levels last seen at the end of World War II. Still, I'm hopeful we're at the brink of completing the recovery. The news on the health front's been encouraging. Vaccines have rolled out at an impressive pace. Case rates and deaths have fallen and continue to fall. And I always remind myself that the strategy of rolling out vaccinations based on age was not a case elimination strategy. It was instead one focused on increasing confidence by reducing the number of the most serious outcomes. So far, so good. Now, assuming continued progress on the health front, you should see, I'd say we're already seeing a really strong spring and summer. Excess savings and fiscal stimulus are funding pent-up demand from consumers who are exhausted from isolation and freed up by vaccines and warmer weather. You already see this in the data. Consumer confidence has skyrocketed. April automotive sales at 18.5 million were the highest since 2005. That's 18.5 million annually. March retail sales increased 9.6% versus February, and real-time metrics of card spending continue to run 15 to 20% higher than they did in 2019. The housing market is still booming. I went to Florida this weekend and I couldn't find a parking spot. The airport lot was full. The only spot I think you're still going to see lag is that related to return to office. Things like transit or business travel or conferences or catering. Now, this surge in demand is causing real challenges in supply chain. A number of manufacturers got behind during the shutdown and they've struggled to catch up to demand. Ships have been backlogged at West Coast ports. The ice storm in Texas disrupted chemical manufacturers. Chip shortages are limiting automobile production. Houses are in short supply. And now, a somewhat surprising supply chain challenge is in staffing. Now, that's been the case in manufacturing, construction, and technology for months. But even now, service sector companies are telling me they're not able to find enough employees to meet their demand. We got a jobs report on Friday of 266,000 jobs that was much weaker than the demand levels would have suggested. The job opening rate is 5.3%. That's the highest in the 20+ year history of that series. And that's, of course, strange when you have 8.2 million fewer people employed and a 6.1% unemployment rate. So what's the story here? Part of it is the extremely sharp increase in demand I discussed with the vaccines rolling out that has surprised a bunch of employers. Part of it's a drop in participation, particularly from parents who have elevated care responsibilities with schools closed and the like, and also from a surge in retirees. We've had 3 times the percentage of retirees than you would have expected. Perhaps health concerns also remain an issue. And particularly when additional stimulus payments and excess savings driven by reduced spending give workers the financial wherewithal to be choosy. Maybe instead of more pent-up demand, we're seeing repressed supply. Regardless, we have a frictional challenge, matching open jobs to surplus workers. That frictional challenge is most pronounced at lower wage levels. That's where you really hear the noise, is under the $15 or so wage level. And you can see it in the most recent labor market data, which shows significant wage pressure in industries like leisure, retail trade, and the like. The question of how to unclog the labor market is going to be a critical one. In the meantime, these supply chain and staffing challenges look like they're going to last into the summer, and they're leading to bare shelves and lengthened delivery times. If anyone's tried to buy an appliance lately, you would have seen that. The Richmond Fed Manufacturing Survey showed vendor lead times at the longest ever and inventories at the lowest ever. And these shortages could also limit the upside in GDP if manufacturers just can't produce enough to meet this summer's demand. Of course, that then brings us to the question of inflation. Now, economic theory would suggest that strong demand and constrained supply should lead to price increases. In truth, we've already been seeing price pressures in construction materials, freight, energy, and agricultural commodities for several months. Average home prices are up 13% year over year. Yesterday, we finally started to see the same lift in consumer prices. The 12-month CPI rose 4.2%, with the core version that excludes food and energy up 3%. Part of that is base effects. It's mathematical. Last year, we had 3 negative months, and those are now dropping from the baseline. But even if you look at the 3-month CPI, you'll see that up 5.6% annualized. And so there's more than just base effects going on. Part of it is recovery in the parts of the economy, like apparel and travel, that are most affected by last year's shutdowns. Some of the areas with the biggest price increases were haircuts, taxis, casinos, airlines, rental cars. Those are all places where you had price deflation a year ago, and they're coming back to normal. But part is also pent-up demand in a time of reduced supply. Used cars, which are being affected by the chip shortage in the new car space, they were a third of this month's increase. When we talk about inflation, we're talking about a multi-year recurring phenomenon. And as I talk to businesses, even those that are taking prices up this year, I still don't hear their medium to long-term expectations on pricing changing, nor do you see it in market measures of inflation expectations. They're not yet escalating above our target. And you have to pay attention to some of these long-term disinflationary forces that we've been seeing over the last 20 years, like the power of big box retailers and their purchasing departments, like the price transparency that's enabled by the internet, and like global access to lower cost product and talent, and wonder whether they're not still keeping inflation expectations modulated. But this is a topic I'm of course watching closely, as well as whether we start to see compensation pressure coming from some of the shortage that I talked about earlier. You may be interested in how some of the proposed infrastructure and family support bills play into all this. Now, of course, I'll leave to Congress the determination of what passes and how to fund it. But I'd note that the demand side isn't really our issue anymore. It's the supply side, generating more participation, reducing job mismatch, getting more people into the workforce. For example, in a world where we're short construction and manufacturer workers, any infrastructure investment needs to also work on developing an infrastructure workforce. And any plan needs to be funded with an eye to our deficit, which, as I said, is now at World War II levels. Throughout this recovery, the Fed has tried to do its part. We know that the least fortunate benefited from the historically strong labor market in 2019. And we hope to support bringing more people in from the sidelines by maintaining accommodative monetary policy, so long as inflation stays moderated. And of course, that's why you watch inflation closely. Thanks. And now, Jonathan, maybe I'll turn over to you and look forward to reactions and questions. And of course, if anyone has any input to give on what they're seeing in terms of labor availability and consumer prices, I'd be very interested in that as well.
Great, thanks, Tom. Really good information. Could you just give us a little bit of information on, or context, I should say, on how the Baltimore, because your region covers Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Richmond, right? So how does Baltimore and it's both the downturn as well as the recovery compared to our other neighboring markets? So.
Yeah, so my region is West Virginia and Maryland, DC, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina. So I don't have Philadelphia.
Okay.
I'd say everything about this downturn starts with the virus and the reaction to it. And it's very clear as I travel, and I have been on the ground, since June, that the southern part of my district in West Virginia, so North Carolina, South Carolina, West Virginia, have been much more open than Northern Virginia, DC, and Maryland. There's just been a lot more engagement with commerce. I think I heard you all had your first outdoor networking event this week, or maybe last week. In South Carolina, they start having them in October. So just to give you a feel how commerce has been going. So that's one big driver. And so one issue. Second driver, of course, is the industry mix. And to the extent you've been exposed to government spending, obviously you've been better off. To the extent you've been exposed to leisure and hospitality spending, worse off. Downtowns have really struggled. And so when you ask about Baltimore, I start with the industry mix. And of course, anything related to downtown and the city itself does struggle because you just haven't had the influx of people that bring in, lunch traffic, dinner traffic, business traffic. It's all been work from home. So that's been a challenge. On the positive side, those sectors of your economy which are related to federal government have actually done well and sustained very well. So where you are in this thing just depends on where you sit. And importantly, the spread in reaction to the virus.
Great, thanks. Another you touched on this a little bit, so if you could expound upon like a number of our and we talked about this when we had our networking event with a number of people on Tuesday night. A lot of small business are really struggling to find labor, and because of a whole variety of reasons, including some of the stimulus money that's being offered to folks that at certain wage groups, which again you touched on. It's almost more advantageous for them, not just for monetary reasons, but for simplicity of life, to just take the stimulus money and not work and participate in the labor force. So how do you see that kind of unfolding?
Well, there's no question, as I think I said, as I talk to businesses, I talk to a bunch that are telling me they're having trouble sourcing the labor that they need to operate their business or to bring their business back. The next question I always ask is, how much do you pay? And on entry level. And there's no question in my mind that there's a significantly higher pain in the lower paid part of the economy. And it's, 14, 15, 16. If you're above that, the pain is much, much less. If you're below that, the pain is quite pronounced. There are a lot of theories about what's going on. I laid out some and you did as well. But I do accept the idea that at all levels, people have more money in their pockets right now. And whether that be the unemployment insurance or the stimulus checks or the reduced spending that people have had over the years. I mean, the stats would suggest that savings rates are high. And that savings rate may give people the wherewithal to be choosy. At a time where there's a lot of talk about entry-level wages, not just in the Congress, but also big announcements by employers. Amazon would be a good example of them increasing their wages. I think McDonald's announced something this morning. And in an environment where you've got big employers increasing their wages, I think it's pretty hard to compete with a lower wage offer because workers have the financial wherewithal to be choosy. And I think we're definitely seeing that. How does it play out? I do take some signal out of what happened, in October, November, December last year. I talked to a lot of employers over the summer that were nervous about their ability to bring people back. That noise went way down at the end of the fall. Some of this extra savings had been spent. And I think people were, getting back in the workforce. I think the constraints that childcare or schools being closed may have created, hopefully, I expect them not to be constraints, when we get in the summer and the fall. As the vaccine rolls out, I think whatever it is, 40% of the people have gotten it. I can tell you when you're in a room with someone who's been double vaccinated, you feel like you were there with a victor, someone with a lot more confidence engaging in the economy. And so hopefully you'll have an ever increasing proportion of people. So people with health concerns will come back. So I expect it to loosen over time, but it might take, as I said, into the summer for us to get to the other side of this particular constraint. And again, I think it is a small business issue, but it's mostly a low wage issue. The big businesses that pay low wage also have this issue. I've talked to small businesses who pay higher wages, and I'm not hearing the same kind of noise.
Great, thanks. I'll grab a few from the audience here. So John Olson asked the question, the Fed's normal mandate is unemployment and inflation controls, or that's part of the mandate. With ballooning federal debt that's over 100% of GDP, what do you think? I'm trying to interpret this. Would the Fed take an overall debt control, even though it's more fiscally related at some point as part of their management? I'm trying to read into that. John, maybe you can clarify your question if I hacked it up. So
no, I don't mind. I just didn't want to jump in.
Yeah.
My point was, I guess, I've heard some numbers like if we get to 160% of GDP, that's where we start to worry about the actual debt being a problem. And it just seems to ever be growing always. And I'm just wondering, at what point do we actually worry from your point of view? And what point should Congress jump in and say, okay, we actually have to control spending a little now and stop debt from growing versus GDP?
Yeah, so national debt, just to give you some numbers, it was about 106% of GDP at the end of World War II. Our forefathers, due to a combination of strong growth and moderate net spending over the next 60 years, took it down to where by 2007 it was actually 38% of GDP. Even before this downturn, it was back up to 80, and most projections have it in the 105 plus or minus range by the end of this year. There have been a lot of studies done about what's a burden. Actually, probably the best well-known of it would have said that 80 or 90 was about as far as you could go. But, our interest rates are still quite low. Italy, of all countries, is at 150 or 160. Their interest rates are low. I saw Greece's interest rates are low. Japan is over 200. So I don't think there is an analytic moment where just by definition, you walk off the bridge. But I do think there is a moment where that happens. I don't personally believe trees grow to the sky, and I don't believe you can borrow money forever. And so, at that moment, what happens is those who invest in your debt decide they don't like it at that price, and they require a higher price for your debt. So interest rates go up. The other constraint you might have is resilience in a downturn. I mean, we invested a bunch of money in this downturn and get into the other side. And we invested more than some other countries did. And our recovery, I think, has been stronger than those countries. And I don't think they didn't invest because they didn't want to. I think they didn't invest because they didn't have the financial wherewithal that we have. And so the other thing that you threaten when you build your debt load is your resilience the next time. So for both those reasons, I think it's important for us to be strategic about our fiscal situation. Now, I'm not sure what's important is today's number. What's important is tomorrow's number, 2022, 2023, 2024. Are we running deficits forever, or are we bringing stuff back into some control? And I do think it's important to do it. I'll just give one anecdote. I saw when the Tea Party stuff all started in 2009 and 10, the Today Show did a little segment where they had around a kitchen table one of each type of constituency. They had a young person and a retiree, they had a union member and a Tea Party, or they had sort of one of every, and they had flashcards on these are the choices it would take to balance the budget. And this group of very disparate Americans balanced the budget in 20 minutes. So it's not clear to me that it can't be done. It just is, do we have the institutional will to do it? And I hope we will.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Aaron Keel asks, you mentioned that the inflation rate ticked up in April. To what extent does do you believe that the COVID-related stimulus contributed to that?
So you've got a few things going on together, maybe even many things going on together. One thing is very significant pent-up demand. I mentioned the card spending rates versus 2019. And that pent-up demand is being driven by vaccines, exhaustion from being, locked in our houses, excess savings. And those excess savings are coming in part from the fiscal stimulus, but also because I didn't take a trip last year. And normally I would have taken, with the family, a couple of vacations. That's money I didn't spend. I didn't go out to dinner last year. That's money for sure I didn't spend. And so a lot of us, saw our credit card bills be significantly lower last year, not because we lost our jobs, but because the opportunities to spend were just down. And so there is a lot more money in people's pockets. Some of it is the fiscal and some of it is their behavior. And both of them have funded, I'd say, this pent-up demand. So that is part of what's driving this pent-up demand. The other part that's driving it is, and some of that pent-up demand isn't related to stimulus at all. I mean, We did a trade deal with China. China would buy more agricultural commodities. They're now buying more agricultural commodities. That's, increased demand and therefore inflation of that. That, isn't related to us. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it, which is related to pent-up demand, I'll just call return to normal. Airline tickets would be or hotel rooms are a great way to think about it. The price of hotel rooms plummeted because no one was going to hotel rooms. Now the price of hotel rooms is coming back, right? That is inflation versus 2 months ago. It's not necessarily inflation versus 2019, but we see it in the inflation stats. So return to normal is another piece of it. A third piece of it is these supply chain constraints we're seeing. And it's, it was messy when we closed down the economy, and it's messy when you reopen the economy. And we remember the messiness from last April and May, but there's real messiness today. If you're at a big auto company, who would have predicted you'd run out of chips for the cars? They didn't think that was a big issue, but there's a lot of demand for chips, I guess, in the laptops and the like, and they just don't have access to chips. So there are real constraints in terms of their ability to make cars. That's a good one. Colonial Pipeline had this ransomware thing. They weren't planning on that. There was an ice storm in Texas. The chemical companies weren't planning on that. And moving stuff in from China at a time of peak demand, people have just really struggled with. So that's also a piece to it. So you've got return to normal, you've got pent-up demand, you've got constrained supply. All of those are drivers of the price pressures we're seeing right now. And again, you could point to stimulus, and as I said, it's part of the pent-up demand story. But I think it's more than that. I think you've got this logistical challenge of shutting an economy down and then bringing it back up. And I just don't think operationally we're built for that kind of guardrail to guardrail kind of economic movement.
It was essentially not just a US shutdown, but a worldwide shutdown too, right? For 3 months.
Right.
So, right.
And it's so interesting. I get the chance when I'm out in the district to talk to businesses about what they're doing. And it's so interesting, the things that are, constraints for them. If you try to go to price a rental car in Florida right now, the one-day pricing is like $380. And you go, well, how could that possibly happen? And then you realize that one of the big car companies went bankrupt and shed presumably a third of its fleet. Nobody else in the car business bought a bunch of cars last year because who knew when the vaccine was going to come out and people would travel again. So they've been cautious. So there's just not enough cars for the demand. And when you think about it that way, yeah, I guess it is pretty hard to just show you and I just expect they're going to be cars whenever we need it, but that's not how they operated their business. They had understandable caution, and everybody has been positively surprised at how fast the vaccine has rolled out and how fast demand has come out, and maybe, how aggressive some of the stimulus efforts have been, to support that. And so that's where we are.
Yes, I think you started touching on this. I think when you used kind of the frictional challenge is that demand is bouncing back a lot faster than supply can keep up, right? So what's your crystal ball tell you about which thing, how long some of this stuff continues, the big supply demand imbalance? So. Well,
there is a lot of extra savings in people's pockets. And so I think I'm very bullish on demand. I think the demand is strong now, and I think the demand will continue, through this year and into next. I just think that's, the nature of it. And it's part money and it's part opportunity. I mean, when businesses finally come back to work, I think there'll be a lot of people who are ready to go to a conference again, or go to, a dinner, a business dinner or whatever. So I think there's a lot of demand still to come, and then the supply will ease and it'll just take a while. But businesses are creative. People are running overtime. People are trying to meet the demand. You do see a lot of people raising entry-level wages in an effort to get people, to come into the workforce so that they will come out. I do think a lot of the constraints and supply will ease when schools reopen and parents can have confidence that they've got a childcare plan. Again, I think increased wages on the margin bring people into the workforce as well. So I think it's all going to ease, but it's into the summer. I think we've still got a few months to work with on this.
Does that increase in wages start feeding it back into CPI?
It could. When you're talking entry level wages, you have to then look at the business segment. So in a lot of business segments, the entry level part of the workforce, even when you tackle the compression that comes in, is not a big part when you look at a total compensation bill. And so it doesn't drive your cost structure as much. But there are real businesses, fast food is a great example where those wages are a big part of the cost structure, and presumably there will be pricing implications of increased wages. Now, anyone who takes prices up has to think about what the consumer reaction is going to be. Presumably you were pricing for profitability to start. And so people that I talk to are not cavalier about pricing decisions. They don't just assume everyone will buy it if they increase the price. They really have to think about the trade-offs that consumers are making. But sure, cost pressures, especially industry-wide cost pressures, are the kinds of things that drive pricing.
Sounds good. Somebody asked a question in private chat here. Matt Bormel did that. Let's see if I can interpret this. That you touched on this a little bit. That the CPI. I think you're not quite in alignment with Jay Powell, who kind of downplayed inflation as saying it was transitory. So what's your view on whether it sticks with us for a while?
Well, I don't know if I'm in alignment or not, but there are clearly in this most recent inflation reading, if you then go into the item by item, there are elements to this that are in fact transitory, right? I mean, the car rental is a really good example. We're not going to have $380 car rental rates, I don't believe, a year from now. There are also base effects. As I said, things went down last year and they go up, this year, like airlines or whatever. And again, I don't take too much signal from that. What I'm watching closely is what is the pricing mindset of businesses and consumers. For those of you on the call who are around my age, you'll remember that in the 70s, because hopefully you were a teenager like I was, every time you went to the grocery store, the candy bars got smaller. And they did that every year in the 70s. And that was just what the expectation was. The candy bars got smaller and smaller. You can tell I'm still grieving about that. Well, I don't know that that's consumer expectation today. In fact, I don't think my expectations have changed for what the price of a book ought to be or the price of a dinner. And so businesses really have to think hard before they make multi-year decisions to say, if you go out for a breakfast omelet, it's not going to be $10.99. It's going to be $20.99. I'm not sure I'm ready to pay that for it. And so I think those are the calculuses that businesses make on pricing. And as I talk to them, I'm trying to ask the question, well, is this a one-time effort because your costs are up and you're trying to maintain your margins? Or are you really changing your behavior? I've talked to one of the biggest big box retailers in the world. They know there are a few segments they have to take price increases, but they're not changing their mindset that what they're going to do is offer everyday low price. And if they see another price increase, they're going to do something different. I think those are the factors that are keeping pricing controlled. Other examples, I talked to a small business that has a furniture business. And I said, well, your input costs are going up. Are you going to increase your prices? He goes, well, look, before anyone comes into one of my shops, they go online and shop me. So I can't increase prices, right, and still have people come into the store. And that is the mindset a lot of people have. And until that changes, this sort of persistent recurring inflation, I think is still not likely.
Since we probably mostly have small business owners and or managers on the line here, do you have any suggestions on businesses that you think have opportunity to really thrive in this next 2 or 3 years?
You said at the beginning I was a consultant for 30 years, so that's just catnip to give me that kind of question. No, the world moves. I actually think small businesses are very agile and they adjust as the world moves. And I'm sure they're going to find sectors that are in deep need of a different and new solution. Some of the folks I talk to that are, screaming that there's opportunity, home health is a classic example. You've got an aging workforce. You've got a less attractive, perhaps, nursing home model in the context of COVID. Childcare, as I was in Parkersburg, West Virginia yesterday. talking to people really in need of childcare and solutions that, solved that. I think anyone who could supply skilled trades into, a market that has got a lot of demand would, find real opportunities. There's a lot of those opportunities, but you just got to come up with a business model for these things that help supply the demand profitably.
Does anybody from the audience have questions? Opening it up here, you can send them in by chat, raise your hand, or just we're a small enough group too. You can just kind of shout out, I think. So
I have just a comment. I'm a member of the FTA here locally, and every year Andy Bauer briefs us. I just want to share with you, I guess it's probably his ultimate manager. He's awesome. His
good
delivery, everything he does to teach us every year in January is awesome. So I just want to pass on some positive feedback.
Well, thanks. We're very open for positive feedback. So anyone else who has some, I'm eager to do it. Andy's great. I was with him yesterday on these sessions in Parkersburg, and he does a great job leading our Baltimore branch and our outreach in both in Maryland and West Virginia.
Any other questions or comments? Well, I'll throw out another one too. We had in our regional economic development committee the other day, we talked about like this whole people working from home and how much of it kind of persists and becomes kind of a more distributed workforce, not so concentrated. You touched on this a little bit about like that part of the economy being slower to recover. Any thoughts on kind of the long-term impacts of people being able to work in different places?
Well, I worked as a consultant for 30 years. I embrace flexible work. And I think it's a lot of institutions, including our institution, were probably not that open to it before, and I think are just necessarily going to be more open to it. I have an essay that was published, I think even today on the website that this is not a setup question, but it gives me the opportunity to talk about something I'm pretty passionate about, which is that I don't think we know where this is going to land because I don't think the market has spoken on it yet. And here's what I mean by it. A lot of us have said, wow, we were just as productive when we were at home. But it's one thing to be productive at home when everybody's at home. And it's another thing to be productive at home when not everybody's at home. So, for those of you who sell things, the first time you lose a sale because your competitor had a dinner with a customer or a client or, roamed the halls and built a relationship and you didn't, what are you going to do? I think you're going to buy a plane ticket. There are a lot of employers who think that they're going to have everybody work from home and they're going to save money on office space. But then there are other employers who think that being in person is really important for building culture and networking and relationships and innovation. Well, those two businesses are going to compete each other and one of them's going to win. And I don't know which one's going to win, but the market's going to have its say on that. And even, a lot of employers, will say, I don't know, I've got to let people work remote because otherwise I can't have talent. And they're going to be competing with people who believe their proposition to talent is you're going to come in and learn from other people and you're going to be in the office. And so those employers are going to compete in the talent market and one of them's going to win. I'm not sure, may differ by sector. And even employees who, I'm teasing a little, but I've talked to a lot of millennials who just bought a dog and, want to take care of the dog and they want to work at home and that's all they want to do. Well, maybe they'll win, but, they're going to have to compete against other potential employees who either also want to work remotely, but are much cheaper, right? Or who want to come into the office and build their skills. And we not know this for 5 or 10 years, but some of those employees are going to win and some are not. So I just think the market hasn't really weighed in. And so we're having a constrained conversation based on sort of a sense of what our people want or don't want, or what what we want or don't want. And I just think this is going to be an interesting, maybe even a fun market test of what do we really need to win. In my shop, we are bringing people back, but we are embracing flexibility. I think that's the winning answer, but that's just in my business. There are lots of other businesses out there.
Yeah. Each business has a different kind of need for the collaboration versus independence, right? So
Exactly.
Matt re-asked, sorry, Matt, I missed the second part of your question the first time around. So Matt's asking, do you think the CPI is a limited metric for determining inflation? So.
Well, we actually use, this is now geek technical talk, so I apologize for it. We actually use a different indicator called the PCE, which came out about 2 weeks ago with a lower inflation number. It's probably just lagging the CPI. So I talked about the CPI only because it was, pretty current, and I thought people would want to talk about it. It typically runs 30 or 40 basis points higher than the PCE, because the PCE, it adjusts shares for actual spending. That may or may not have been your question. The question might be, wait a second, I see inflation in lots of stuff, not just consumer prices. So why aren't we talking about everything? And I think, all this stuff is, fairly debated. There's been a lot of work over the years on, what might be our mandate is inflation, is stable prices. It actually says stable prices. It doesn't say a particular metric to use or index. It doesn't talk about whether it should be 1%, 2%, or 4%. And we've defined it over the years based on our sense that the PCE was probably the most grounded, holistic, and sort of dynamic measure of inflation. But, I look at multiple measures, not just the PCE, and I think we should.
Like a kind of a side question, I haven't looked at the PPI recently. Is that tracking even more robust than the CPI?
Yeah, well, it came out this morning. I studied up for today's session. But no, the input cost inflation has definitely been more significant than consumer price inflation. In other words, those inputs aren't yet fully being passed on to consumers. Some may and some may not. And this morning's reading was also a strong, meaning a significant increase. I think it was 0.6 of a basis point, 0.6 of a point, 60 basis points on the producer prices. And, producer prices are part of your cost structure, but compensation is also part of your cost structure. And compensation's been up roughly, 3% year over year. And so you'd expect to see some modulation between producer prices and consumer prices. And then you've also got productivity, which has actually been up quite significantly over the last year. That also helps, small and big businesses with their margins.
Sounds good, thanks. Christy asks an interesting follow-on question to further conversation. We talked about the low level or the lower tier of wages, and she's asking, do you see upward pressure on the next tier up in kind of wage earners? So,
well, when you talk to employers who are feeling pressure to move their entry-level wages up, they are also now worried about compression, in that next tier up. I'd say at this point, it's more something people vocalize as opposed to something you can find in the data. But that doesn't mean, it won't come in the data. I think if it does come in the data, it'll come at a lower percent because some people will accept some amount of compression. At the higher levels, this has been an interesting downturn because if you go back to the last downturn, wages dropped precipitously between 2008 and 2009. In this downturn, they've actually stayed pretty stable, and they've stayed stable on the downside and stable on the upside so far. And I'm thinking, the overall weighted average as opposed to, any particular company or sector. And so we'll see how it plays out. I think it must be that the short-term nature of this, was probably different than as people perceived the longer-term nature of 2008. It's also true 2008 hit a couple sectors like the finance sector that are relatively high wage sectors pretty hard. So that might have been part of it too.
Thank you. Anybody else have any other questions? Feel free to just shout them out or add them in the chat, excuse me. So. I have one probably more specific to my industry. So we're involved in the real estate and development industry all around the country. And so there is a shortage of labor and materials in almost every category at this point for a whole host of reasons. And while I'm normally a fan of us needing infrastructure improvements, bridges and roads and things like that, I'm just, and I think you kind of mentioned this as an infrastructure workforce, like it seems to me pouring fuel on the fire, as I call it, is not really helpful to our economy. So any commentary that you might have? So.
Well, I guess just to agree with you. I mean, I would be one of those people who believe that, a well-targeted infrastructure program would be important for our economy, whether that be our productivity or our logistics, repairing bridges, distributing broadband, all those things feel like important things to do. I do worry about whether we've got the capacity to build that infrastructure right now without overwhelming, other parts. We'll see where they land. The current proposals are over 10 years. So, the numbers are big, but when you think about it over 10 years, maybe it's not quite as, big a pressure. And so you have to, and of course, a lot of them will take some time to design and get ready for. So you just have to think about, how that plays out in the context of what the overall need's going to be. Right now, manufacturing and those skills are quite tight because of this rotation to goods that I mentioned earlier. Maybe that'll ease, as the services come back online. Construction has been quite aggressively, part of that's residential because people are, that market's been hot. Part of it's been warehouses and distribution as e-commerce has really exploded. So maybe there'll be some loosening there. But, even before this downturn, we were short skilled trades and everybody would say that. And so I do think if you're going to do an infrastructure bill, which seems to me to, have a rationale to it, you have to have an infrastructure workforce bill and, maybe an infrastructure resource bill. I haven't missed the plot on lumber prices, which are obviously escalating as well, and steel. But all those have to work together. I mean, you have to think about how to do it. How do you free the supply constraints? And it's not that it's not doable. I just think it has to be worked.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Seems like there's no end in sight for most of these things right now. No near-term end in sight. The demand far exceeds supply in most cases, and there's already a backlog of a year in some cases of many products. So,
well, there is a commodity cycle. These things do end. I was in South Carolina a week before last, and I was driving from place to place, and literally every turn I made, I was behind a truck with a bunch of trees on it. Mm-hmm. And so, lumber prices go up, people supply more lumber. I think that's, when steel prices go up, people will import more steel. I think those things will settle over time. We'll just see how long it takes.
Mm-hmm. Christy asks another question. DC salaries in her industry are 10 to 15% higher in Baltimore than, higher in DC than Baltimore. I said that backwards. And the difference, because theoretically, the difference in cost of living is higher in DC versus Baltimore. But then if people are working remotely, then how does that pan out? This is kind of a labor question for sure. So.
Yeah, we'll see. We have the same issue. The Fed pays different amounts by different cities. And so we're facing this question in our own shop. But economic theory is pretty clear, which is that, we have had in individual cities, I'll call them moats, individual markets where people have been able to pay, individual pay, at least in certain sectors. That's not true in every sector. And if jobs are able to be done remotely, you will create more competition for those jobs. And so the person in the lowest price areas, I already talked to, technology folks in North Carolina who say their lower price technology people are being poached by, Silicon Valley and the like. They, in theory will get an increase, and that competition should hold down wages in some of the higher cost areas where you've got competition. And to me, it's no different than, trade barriers and how you think about it. That'll take some time, but that's how it ought to work if that's the market you've got. I always say, though, to the folks I talk to who are excited about working fully remote, don't forget, if you can work fully remote from wherever Baltimore, you can work fully remote from India.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like this is kind of an acceleration of what was already happening too in kind of the gig economy, right? Of people working kind of project by project or whatever that they could, this just helps accelerate both the availability of it and the productivity of it, right? So
yeah, It could, again, I think the market's going to settle on all this. I don't know. I think there will be sectors, businesses, industries where this notion of having a fully gig workforce, fully remote, whatever, will be great. And that's, what you want to do. And you don't need to talk about culture because either you figured out how to do it remotely or it's not that important to your competitive success. But there'll be a lot of other businesses, I think that's less true. And so you always have to be careful about extrapolating from a moment, particularly a moment like this, where we're all going to go back at some way, shape, or form. And 6 months from now, we're going to have a totally different feel than we do today. And it's hard to predict it.
Yeah, good point. I had an economics person tell me a long time ago that people always think of either or, but life's a lot about ands, right? We're just creating more choices, not less. So
that's a good thing to remember.
Anybody else have questions or comments? Anybody else? Going once, twice? Otherwise, been my pleasure to help moderate and have some dialogue with you, Tom, and appreciate everybody else joining. Christy, do you want to say some closing words?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan and Tom. This has been a great presentation. And thanks to all our guests for joining us. We hope you can tune in for some of our future events. Our next webinar is on May 19th, and our Spirit of Community Awards event is coming up on May 24th. We do have an in-person multi-chamber networking event at Walden Country Club on June 3rd. And lastly, our golf tournament is returning this year, and it will be held on June 15th at Turf Valley Resort in Ellicott City. That will be our first major event in person, so we're excited to see you all there. Our schedule can be found on our website at www.centralmarylandchamber.org. And we will share a link to the video of this session today and the chat information soon. So keep an eye out for an email from one of our team members within about the next 24 hours. But thank you again to our incredible presenter, Tom Barkin, our moderator, Jonathan Williams, and all the members of our Regional Economic Development Committee for a great presentation. And we hope to see you soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, Tom. Have a good day.
Great to be with you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.